Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on the State of Freedom.
Moms for Liberty East Baton Rouge Parish Chapter is dedicated to fighting for the survival of America by unifying, educating, and empowering parents to defend and take back their parental rights at all levels of government. To learn more or to get involved with Moms for Liberty East Baton Rouge, email momsforlibertybatonrouge@gmail.com. That's moms, the number 4, libertybatonrouge@gmail.com. The email address is on the Patriot page of our website, freedomstate.us, and it's in the show notes. Today we have Chris Macaluso joining the show. He's the director of the Center for Marine Fisheries at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and we're really looking forward to the conversation. Before we talk to Chris, let me read the scripture of the day. It's from Psalm chapter 62, and it says, "I'm standing in absolute stillness, silent before the one I love, waiting as long as it takes for him to rescue me. Only God is my Savior, and he will not fail me, for he alone is my safe place. His wraparound presence always protects me as my champion defender. There's no risk of failure with God, so why would I let worry paralyze me, even when troubles multiply around me? God's glory is all around me. His wraparound presence is all I need. For the Lord is my Savior, my hero, and my life-giving strength." And that's Psalm chapter 62, verses 5 through 7. And, as I was reading that, I was just thinking, this is a time when the Lord is calling many to be bold, to make changes, and to step out in faith, and that can be scary. But what an incredible encouragement this passage is, reminding us that there is no risk of failure with God. When we move in obedience to him, he will bring the success. He will bring the increase. He will bring the victory. He protects us and he defends us. He strengthens us for the assignments to which he's called us. And Chris, I can't help but think of that famous quote from John Quincy Adams as I was reading that this morning that you so often remind us of, that duty is ours and the results are the Lord's.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And each day we get up, we do our job, try to honor God and do the best we can, to preserve freedom and liberty. And in the case today, with our great guest today, to preserve our wetlands and our coasts. Chris Macaluso, what a joy to have you with us today. We know you're the head of the director of the Center for Marine Fisheries at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, where you've been for about 11 years now. Also, our guest is an avid fisherman, which I was very, very glad to read about and hear about. Chris, welcome to the show. Tell us about TRCP and your primary focus there.
Well, first off, really appreciate you guys having me on today. And I try to take every opportunity to talk to folks about this, especially those who have connections to Louisiana and things like this, because it's important to understand, what's happening with our wetlands and how those things affect, our culture, our economy, our ability to be connected to the land, and that those things that are so important here in Louisiana. So thank you for that. TRCP, we've been around for just over 20 years. We're a national nonprofit hunting and fishing organization. We're really more well-known out west. We've got a lot more staff in the Rocky Mountain region and in that area who work on hunting and fishing policies and really land use policies out there that, with an eye on making sure that people have the opportunity to go hunting and fishing. Really, the really mission statement of the organization is to try to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish and quality opportunities to hunt and fish. And, that involves a lot of dealing with public policy and dealing with elected officials and appointed officials from both state and federal agencies. And while a lot of folks haven't really, may not have heard of our organization, they've heard of the organizations we work with. Some of my closest partnerships in terms of trying to, address habitat loss or to establish better fisheries management or give us more opportunity to be on the water are organizations like the Coastal Conservation Association, CCA, the National Marine Manufacturers Association, the American Sport Fishing Association, which is the trade association for all of the major fishing tackle manufacturers in the world, really. the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, the International Game Fish Association, Ducks Unlimited. These are the organizations that we work with on a daily basis to try to make effective policy changes and hopefully tweak laws here and there to give us more opportunity to have better hunting and fishing chances and, better habitat for the animals that we like to hunt and fish for. So that's really what we do. Over the last 11 years of being at TRCP, we worked on a number of things. Primarily what I've focused on is helping Louisiana and the Gulf Coast recover from the oil spill, but not just the impacts from that spill, but the long-term impacts of things that we've been dealing with in coastal Louisiana. The habitat loss that came from our, losing our barrier islands and our marshes, just the profound amount of wetland loss that we've experienced in Louisiana, but also working with organizations across the country and, throughout the Gulf to help fix the problem that we were having with red snapper fishing, where we were facing federal regulations that was going to limit our ability to snapper fish down to 3 days when it ultimately came to a head. And now in Louisiana, you look at it and, snapper season's been open all summer and it could possibly be open throughout the rest of the year. So we went from a system where they were, the federal government was telling us, you're only going to be able to snapper fish for 3 days, despite the population being larger than it ever had been, to now a system where we got the science better and we got the policies better. And now you can have a snapper season that lasts 150 days. And we're still not killing more fish than the Fed said that we were killing in a 3-day period. So a lot of it just depends on getting the approach right, getting the science right, getting the data right, and getting kind of right-minded people to think about these things, to where the reflexive, stance that you take from a government perspective is not to limit the opportunity to be on the water, but instead is how do we get the data collection, the science better so that we can increase the opportunities for people to be on the water.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for what you're doing. I just think, one, you're a brilliant guy to be able to figure out how to fish as often as you possibly can as part of your job. Kudos to you for that one. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm going to take some notes from you after the show because I need to spend some more time out on the water. We were talking before we came on, and now that I grew up in Terrebonne and I moved back here a few years ago, but I grew up fishing in Pointe-à-Cher. And I've seen the deterioration of our barrier islands. I've seen the bayous get engulfed by lakes, and I have seen that the lakes look like they're now part of the Gulf of Mexico. So fishing has dramatically changed in my lifetime. What is being done to restore our barrier islands, our coastlands, and what needs to be done?
Well, that's a great question. I think in terms of barrier islands, in the last decade, really going back to the oil spill, more has been done in Louisiana to restore barrier islands than at any other time in our history. If you look at all of the barrier islands west of the Mississippi River, so that would be more or less from, the mouth of the Mississippi River west to almost to the Atchafalaya Bay. Almost every one of those barrier islands has had some kind of restoration project conducted on them. And what happened after the oil spill was that the size and the scope of those projects went from $20 to $30 million or even $15 to $20 million projects up to like $100+ million projects. So because those oil spill penalties got directed back down to Louisiana and to the other Gulf states, but primarily Louisiana, in order to be able to address the damage caused by the spill itself. But at the same time, we were able to take that money and use it to address that centuries-long loss that we had all been seeing, where our barrier islands were being carved up and washed away. So, you went from projects that were restoring, say 1,000 feet of beach or 50 acres to projects that restore an entire island that, can restore multiple thousands of feet of beach and restore multiple thousands of feet of dune and hundreds of acres instead of dozens of acres. And so, that work has ramped up significantly in Louisiana. And there are a couple more barrier islands that are going to be addressed. When you look at east of the Mississippi River, the northern Chandeleur Islands, the state is still trying to secure ultimately the money that it's going to take to do a restoration of that island. And it's going to, again, be another project that's $200 million plus. And all of that was made possible by our congressional delegation, and the settlements that were reached with BP and the offending parties after the oil spill, who made it a point to make sure that as much of that money came to Louisiana to address not just the damage from the oil spill, but the long-term crisis that we were dealing with in land loss. So the barrier islands are obviously important, but also restoring the interior marsh is important. Those are really the nursery grounds for the fish that we like to catch, and even the ones that support the commercial fisheries, like your brown shrimp, your white shrimp, your crabs, mullet, menhaden, juvenile speckled trout, really the whole life chain, the whole food chain of our system starts in those marshes. But what is also important to keep in mind is that, the more land that you lose inside the barrier islands, the more marsh that gets lost, the harder it is to restore a barrier island and keep it at its current footprint, because the Gulf of Mexico is coming, right? There's just not a lot we can do to stop the Gulf from coming in through those passes, especially when the hole behind those islands gets larger and larger. If you dig a hole in your backyard, let's say, and it rains, water is going to fill up to that hole till it can't go in there anymore, right? So what the water is always going to do is seek to fill those holes. And so the less marsh and the deeper the water gets behind those islands, the harder it is to stop the Gulf from coming in. So all of those things have to work in concert with each other. Restoring the barrier islands without figuring out how to put more marsh behind them ultimately means that you're going to have to do a lot more maintenance on your islands, and you're going to have to go back and restore them a lot quicker because the water is going to keep eating at it.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, I'm gathering from what you're saying is that you're dealing with, I'm sure, frequently federal regulatory agencies that are oftentimes can be very bureaucratic and even very frustrating to deal with, no matter who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. Has it been frustrating at times to deal with the federal regulatory facet of this? And who are some of the leading political figures in Louisiana who have helped sort of bridge that relationship and helped to facilitate some of these accomplishments that you have had and are seeking?
Sure. Yeah, it's a chronic issue, and there are some federal agencies that are easier to deal with than others. Fish and Wildlife Service tends to be a little bit more aggressive in dealing with the bureaucracies and expediting permitting processes, whereas the Corps of Engineers tends to be a little bit more difficult at times. And I mean, that's no secret. Those guys hear it all the time. Dealing with the Corps and I'll give you an example. Like you look at some of these diversion projects that were put in place really for fisheries restoration, like the Davis Pond diversion, which is in St. Charles Parish, or the Carnarvon diversion, which is in St. Bernard. Those projects got original congressional approval in the 1950s. In the case of Carnarvon, it didn't really start operating until the early 90s. Davis Pond didn't really start operating until the 2000s, 2010 in that time frame. So, the bureaucracies, the permitting processes and things like that can be very frustrating. And then, one of the cases that our congressional delegation has tried to make is that rather than having to go each time you want to restore a marsh in a particular basin, or each time you want to restore a barrier island, the way the federal permitting processes worked was you had to go through a completely different, environmental impact statement and analysis, and go through all the bureaucratic processes and legal processes for each individual project. Why can't you just have a programmatic environmental impact statement process for everything in that basin? Right? I mean, they're all essentially trying to accomplish the same thing. And what happens is, as these projects languish in these bureaucracies, the price tags go up, right? I mean, for a variety of reasons: inflation, labor costs, materials, et cetera, the price of fuel. All of these things make these projects get more expensive. So if you take a project, and this is not even a coastal project, but let's take a look at like the Comite Diversion Project, for instance, that's supposed to move water out of the Amite Basin towards the Mississippi River Basin so that my house doesn't flood again, that kind of thing in Baton Rouge. Well, the more you wait on development and construction of that project, the more expensive it gets, right? And so Congress, instead of securing $400 million, they had to get $800 million. Instead of $1 billion, it had to be $1.5 billion. And it's the same thing with coastal restoration projects. The longer it takes to make your way through those bureaucracies and get the projects on the ground, the more expensive. And as those projects get more expensive, then you have to go back to Congress and get additional authorizations for that.
Money.
Yeah,
More
you got
money.
to get more appropriation and more authorization. Like if a coastal restoration project increases in price, more than 20%, the Corps of Engineers has got to go back and get that project reauthorized, which means you've got to go through the entire congressional process of getting it put into a piece of legislation again. So it can be very, very frustrating. But I think what happened after the oil spill was we made a very effective case, starting, and this was prior to the oil spill, but starting after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, our congressional delegation and our gubernatorial leadership and our legislators started making very effective cases to the federal government that these timeframes have to be shortened. And you saw commitments coming into Louisiana, like the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, which was in 2006, which our entire congressional delegation participated in, but was really, credited to, I think Mary Landrieu's the one who really bulldogged that one in particular. But since, if you look at things like during the Trump administration, him tracking things like the diversions and some of the Barrier Island projects through the Corps of Engineers, that was really being pushed by Bill Cassidy, Garrett Graves, Steve Scalise. And really, because Garrett Graves had been the chair of the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority under Governor Jindal, he was and had worked in the Senate environmental committees and knew the lay of the land so well in dealing with the Corps of Engineers. He was really effective in working with that administration and getting some of these projects fast tracked. So we've made a lot of progress, there's no doubt, but the delays in the bureaucratic processes are always going to be frustrating.
Yeah. And I guess as long as we're dealing with the government and multiple layers of the bureaucracy and regulatory issues, that will always be an issue. But it's certainly good to hear that there have been improvements made to expedite the process, because ultimately, when they are delayed the way you've been talking about for protracted periods of time, ultimately the taxpayers are bearing the burden, are they not, Chris?
They are. And, in the case of the oil spill money, it's not taxpayer dollars, right? So, I mean, you're not seeking, appropriations from, the general federal budget, what it was penalties.
Right.
It could go further if the price tag didn't keep doubling, though.
Right. No, you're right. And more could be done. But I think another thing to think about is that the longer you have to wait to build a coastal restoration project, the more dire the situation becomes, right? The more the more it's needed, the less effective the original proposal becomes, because the land loss, the subsidence, and all the things that have contributed to the land loss, that continues to happen. The hurricanes keep coming.
Yeah, the problem gets progressively worse while you're waiting.
Right. So, time is absolutely of the essence, both from a cost perspective and also from the effectiveness of the project perspective. But yeah, without the oil spill monies and the oil spill money stops flowing, presumably within the next 7 years here in Louisiana, we're going to have to find other sources, and we're going to have to be efficient about using that money, because really the only consistent source of money that's coming into the state to address some of these coastal problems, it comes from oil and gas royalties, royalty sharing for oil and gas production offshore in Louisiana. And there's some money that comes from inshore production, but most of the royalties that we're collecting now are coming from offshore oil and gas production, and presumably wind, right? I mean, wind farms are coming. I mean, that's just one of those realities that we're going to have to deal with. But how do we take some of the revenues generated by the federal government from that process and put that back into conservation as well? That's going to be critical in guaranteeing that there's a long-term source of money for the projects that are going to continue to need to be built here in the state, not just restoration, but protection. Oil and gas, the penalties from the oil spill can't really be used on levees and floodgates and things like that, right? In certain isolated incidents, they can. When we start talking about things like armored shoreline protection and levees and floodgates and those sort of things, the physical things that protect, not only habitat, but people, that really doesn't come out of oil spill money. That has to come from another revenue source. And so we've got to find that source and make it consistent so that you can do a consistent job of planning what those projects are going to be.
I'm excited to share a fantastic opportunity for State of Freedom listeners who are interested in investing in precious metals or even starting a home-based business in the precious metals industry. Metal Stacks is a precious metals collectors club where you can buy your metals at the best prices on the market, actual dealer cost. They are beating the big sites. They have no credit card fees and no minimums. If you're just interested in purchasing metals at a great price, visit metalstacks.com/dwalker. Get to shopping. That helps me out. I get the commission. You can also refer people to Metal Stacks for an additional income. If you're interested in learning about the referral business aspect of Metal Stacks, email me directly at Danielle@freedomstate.us for more information. Chris, as you have had fits and starts with the federal government and fought the bureaucracy, has TRCP or any of your coalition partners had to sue the federal government for taking too long? Have you gone after the EPA for some of their onerous regulations, or the Department of Commerce for some of the nonsense that they've pulled with the fisheries?
Our organization doesn't sue. We just don't take that approach. We're a relatively small organization, and tying ourselves to lengthy lawsuits, is sometimes, it's just not one of those things that we can afford to do. But there are organizations that have sued, and, there are organizations that sue to stop certain projects from being built because they feel like, that the regulatory processes or the national environmental policy or whatever has not been followed. There are organizations that sue, because they believe that the federal processes are taking too long. I mean, certainly that does happen, but our organization is not one of those. I mean, what we try to do is find creative, effective ways to change policy and get the bureaucrats within these agencies to be responsive to the lawmakers, right? The lawmakers can apply a lot of pressure. Congress ultimately is the one who appropriates the funding for these agencies.
They got the purse strings for sure. They got the purse strings. Yeah.
So, these agencies want to keep their people employed and they want to keep doing the work. They have to be somewhat responsive to Congress while following the law. And so sometimes that requires you having to tweak a law, and that goes back to some of these things, some of these bedrock environmental laws. While they have accomplished a lot, they have also built so many layers of bureaucracy into the system that it makes it difficult to accomplish the things that I think sometimes the law intends, right? Like, the National Environmental Policy Act or the Clean Water Act or the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Those things really shouldn't be, or, the Magnuson Act. Those things should not be impediments, really, to doing environmental restoration work, which is what coastal restoration work is. They shouldn't be impediments, but sometimes they are. And then you've got to get Congress involved in making tweaks to those laws so that they're not impeding your ability to restore the environment anymore.
And Chris, what's happening with the restoration of freshwater and saltwater ecosystems? For instance, Bayou Terrebonne never had salt water. We have salt water, and people are catching trout and redfish in front of my house now. That never was a thing until, I don't know, maybe right after Hurricane Ida.
Yeah. Well, it's a challenge. There are places in the state, and unfortunately, Eastern Terrebonne Parish is one of those places where it's really hard to tap into freshwater sources. And they're trying, because I think what a lot of folks don't realize about the way our ecosystem works, and really any estuary, is that freshwater is as important a part of it as the saltwater is. And the freshwater is really what's responsible for those interior marshes having the submerged vegetation and the kind of vegetation that hold the marsh together. Yeah, as you've lost a lot more land in Eastern Terrebonne and other parts of the state, as the opportunity to tap into the freshwater sources has diminished, the saltwater just comes in, and I think one of the things you've probably noticed, and, for instance, I met with some commercial fishermen a few weeks ago in Des Allemands who were, which is in the northern Barataria Basin, who were talking about just how fast the tide and the current and things like that move now. Well, it's because the water's gotten deeper and in some spots, and you've got a lot less marsh to slow that tidal movement down. And so the more rapidly that water moves into the interior, the faster it's going to bring the salt water with it. The less marsh you have, the faster the salt water comes in. And that's just an unfortunate reality. I mean, I think the reality is if you can't figure out a way to tap into some of those freshwater sources and get them back, the saltwater fish are going to continue to retreat to retreat inward. And it's just not a natural system. I think, as you've noted, right? Like, you're not a biologist, you're not a scientist, but you've noted, hey, we're catching a lot of saltwater fish in an area where we didn't used to, right? And that's an indication of a system that's in a transition, and it's not a sustainable transition, unfortunately, right? I mean, it's just having saltwater overtake areas that used to be freshwater and brackish marsh doesn't mean that you're going to get saltwater marsh. It means you're going to get dead marsh. And, that's just an unfortunate thing of what we're dealing with subsidence and land loss.
Are the sea levels? We were talking to a couple of people a couple of days ago, and they suggested we ask you this question: are the sea levels on the Louisiana coast actually rising, Chris, or is there actual science to back that up?
There is, and I know climate change is a touchy subject, and I don't get into the politics of climate change. I stay out of those arguments. I mean, I look at the things that can be measured. Right? Like, so there are incremental changes in seawater temperatures. Where the ocean is a little bit warmer, and you see that reflected in the kind of species that we see here. Like, there are tropical fish now, I would say, or South Florida or Caribbean fish that now show up in Louisiana from time to time, and I think that's an indication that our water's getting a little bit warmer. The problem we're dealing with in Louisiana is not just the water levels have risen, which I don't know. I don't know the exact statistics about sea level rise, but I don't think that the problem we're dealing with in Louisiana is so much that the water has risen as it is that the land is sinking. So if you get, let's say, a 3 millimeter increase in sea level, what compounds that in Louisiana is the fact that the land can be sinking as much as 6 inches a decade. So like places, like, for instance, the end of the road at Cocodrie or Grand Isle, Pointe-aux-Chenes, Delacroix, places that used to flood only when you would get tropical systems now flood when you get a strong southeast wind. And it's because the land is sinking. And what used to offset that sinking was more sediment being put on top of it by the Mississippi River. Well, the river's not really putting that sediment in a lot of those places anymore, but the land has continued to sink, unfortunately. And it's not just a coastal marsh problem. It's an interior swamp problem. One of the big reasons why some of our cypress swamps are not as healthy as they once were, and why some of those trees are dying back, is because cypress swamps are supposed to go through a wet and dry cycle where they flood during the spring, but then they dry out in the summer and the fall, and the roots get exposed and all of those things. Like, that's the cycle they're supposed to go through. But now they're in a cycle where they've subsided to the point where the roots are underwater all the time, right? And that's just not healthy for the trees. So subsidence, I think, is really the huge concern in Louisiana. A lot of people think it's all erosion, and erosion's a problem, especially as you lose marsh and you get more open water and you get more wave action that eats away at those shorelines. But really what causes the inundation of that marsh and ultimately the loss of the marsh and the barrier islands and those sort of things is the fact that the land is sinking and you're not putting sediment back on top of it to keep up with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chris, are there other countries that have dealt with this effectively that we could learn from?
The state of Louisiana has done an excellent job, I think, over the last 20 to 30 years in talking with other countries that deal with some of these things. And I don't know that any of them are dealing with them to the extent of Louisiana, but I think the one where we made the quickest analogy was, were the Dutch, where, they had a deltaic system. They had a lot of lowlands and wetlands, and they were dealing with a lot of flooding coming in from the North Sea. And their answer to it was, initially a lot of levees, a lot of floodgates, a lot of just blocking the sea from coming in. But what they found was that had some pretty bad, ecosystem impacts. Like, you just weren't getting the fisheries production you had at one time or the wildlife production. So I think they've shifted that a little bit more. But in terms of like the physical structures to address, flooding from hurricanes and storms and building pumping stations and things like that, we've learned a lot by sharing information with the Dutch. We've also talked a lot with the Vietnamese and sometimes even the Chinese, who have deltaic systems in their coastal areas I don't know that they've built, the extensive levee systems and things like that have ultimately stopped the sediment from getting out. But in terms of dealing with dredging and where the river meets the sea and how do you keep commerce open and how do you keep those ecosystems functioning properly, there has been a lot of information exchange. And you got to give a lot of credit to the state of Louisiana. There's not a lot of things ultimately that we do great here. It's unfortunate that every time you read something about the state, we're somewhere like in 48 to 50,
Very true.
But in terms of addressing issues with coastal land loss and habitat restoration and protecting our communities, we've made a lot of great investments. We've invested in our universities to do the research. We've built facilities where we can bring in the best scientists from across the world, really, to deal with these issues. And so that was the goal after Katrina and Rita, especially. Like we've got to do something about this. This can't just be a levees only policy. We've got to be able to incorporate wetland restoration and better use of sediment, things like that. And so was really the birthplace of things like the Center for River Studies at LSU or the Water Institute for the Gulf. And, those things are not just looking at problems that we have in Louisiana, but how those things can help address these issues across the world.
Yeah.
That's so encouraging to hear because,
Yeah.
we do assume the worst, right? We've grown accomped to assuming the worst. So
Yes.
I hate to admit it about myself, but it's true.
Sure.
We're 48 on a good day in many areas.
It was great though. I mean, in talking with other states, and looking, I had an opportunity to work with a lot, all the other Gulf states, not only their coastal experts, but their fisheries experts, et cetera. And there was really a lot of admiration and even envy at times for Louisiana because we were so far advanced in developing our coastal policy. And really that was forced on us by Katrina and Rita. We had to figure out a way to address these crises we were dealing with. But, developing our coastal master plan, our annual plans, and really investing in the science behind those things put us at an advantage after the oil spill when the funding became available because we had projects ready to go that we could start plugging that money in, whereas the other states had to take a lot of time to do planning.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, you talked earlier about red snapper and opening up that season, extending it and working with the feds on that. Several pieces of legislation were passed in Louisiana this session that limit the size and catch, the number allowed of a number of species of fish. In your view, as both a fisherman and a conservationist, is that a good thing? Are they gonna, what is that gonna mean for our recreational and charter fishers? Is it gonna actually make a meaningful difference in the population, or is this just more restraints on our freedom to fish?
Well, I think, and I know you're talking about speckled trout and redfish, and those were decisions that were lengthy debates made at the Wildlife Fisheries Commission, and those guys did the best they could with the science that was presented to them, which I think is an accurate reflection of the fact that our populations have decreased in some of these fish, and there's a number of factors that can be attributed to it. I think the unfortunate thing is when a population of say speckled trout in your state gets below a certain reproductive ability or the population size gets below a certain level, the term that they use to say that something has to be done in terms of lowering the limits is called overfishing, right? Which I think puts the onus entirely on those who are doing the fishing, right? There are a number of environmental factors that contribute to the ebbs and flows of a fish population. In Louisiana, the number one factor is habitat loss. So it's not really the fault of recreational fishermen. It's not overfishing necessarily that is leading to the decline in production. It's really the habitat loss, right? The loss of that ideal habitat where these fish need to grow up, but also the things that they eat need to grow up. And the same can be said about redfish too. Redfish, I think especially, really rely on that marsh habitat as juveniles, and they don't leave that marsh habitat until they get to spawning size, which is generally a 25 to 26 inch plus redfish. So I think changing the limits was certainly appropriate. And I can say that it did bother a lot of people that it had to happen. But, I've been fishing Louisiana for 45 years, really paying attention to it for 30 plus years. And I can tell you that my ability to be productive on the water in terms of the number of fish I've caught in the last 10 years has declined significantly. And I don't think it's because I'm gotten to be a worse fisherman. I think it's that a lot of the places where I caught fish just don't have those populations of fish anymore. We just don't have the productivity, unfortunately. So the way I like to explain it to people when all of that was happening was the expectation of productivity in Louisiana. And don't get me wrong, it's still the most productive fishery in the Gulf and probably the second most productive fishery in the entire nation behind Alaska. But the expectation of that productivity outweighs the reality of what we can produce now, right? People expect us to continue to be able to go out and catch 100 speckled trout like it's no problem. But the ecosystem doesn't produce that level of fish anymore. And so, and until and unless we really address a lot of the habitat concerns and bring some of that habitat back, I think, unfortunately, those populations are going to continue to go down. I didn't have a lot of issues with the moves they were making in terms of reducing the limits. In the case of redfish, legally it had to happen. Legally we had to figure out a way to get more of those fish to enter into the spawning stock. But I've had a lot of quiet conversations with charter captains and people who at one time may have been against, say, reducing the speckled trout limit from 25 to 15, and they tell me that it has made a difference. Not only when the fishing is good, they're not spending as much time on the water. Which I think some of them think is a good thing, right? Because, you can go back to the dock at 10 instead of 1 or whatever, during the summertime. But I think they also have noted that the fish are staying in certain areas for longer periods, right? They're not getting fished out necessarily as quickly.
I think that one of the reasons why you are such a powerful asset and resource is that you view this from the perspective of an avid fisherman and an avid hunter and someone who understands the importance of being able to continue, for fishermen and to be able to, and hunters to be able to continue to enjoy the land and enjoy the habitat in that way. And you recognize the connection between the potential to continue to enjoy that the way we do and the importance of preserving our coastland and preserving the habitat and that sort of thing. So one of the things that makes me very comfortable with you is that you are just not someone who is just, it's not just about the aesthetics to you. It's not just about people being able to go visit and take pictures and have a vacation somewhere. It's about being able to hunt and fish on the land and to do it in a way that that we don't have to be overly restrictive, but you're recognizing that there are certain things that need to be done, things that need to continue to be worked on in order to make sure that we will always be able to do this, not just us, but our children and our grandchildren. So I think you bring a great wealth of knowledge really from both sides, from both perspectives on this. That's why I'm just glad you're out there doing the work that you're doing.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
I couldn't agree more. And it sounds like your organization and you in particular are well positioned to when the redfish or, let's say, production goes through the roof, you are going to be in a position and have the insight and the firsthand knowledge and the willingness to say, well, let's roll back some of this. Let's let people fish a little bit more because we have the population.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I talk to federal agencies and state agencies about those things all the time, and I'll bring up a couple of species that aren't fisheries related. Black bears is one of them. If we've got a big enough population of black bears in some of these states where they were struggling at one time, then hunting should be allowed for them. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I mean, whistling ducks is another thing. Folks in Louisiana call them Mexican squealers, but they're black-bellied whistling ducks. We've got a lot of those ducks. I mean, the population of those have gone up like something like 4,000% in the last decade in Louisiana, but they leave generally they leave and they go back to Mexico and they migrate to other places during the duck season. So why not, if those animals are here, why don't we have opportunities to hunt for them? Why are we going to let bureaucracies and political ideologies get in the way of biological realities? I mean, and I appreciate that you guys bring that up because, a lot of times hunters and fishermen get a bad rap among some of the, the far left and the environmental groups. There's a disdain. But the original environmentalists in this country were hunters and fishermen, the people who made the investments in making sure who our organization is named after, Theodore Roosevelt. The original reason why these important federal lands were set aside and these important habitats were protected was so you had animal productivity, you had fisheries productivity. And then you look at the excise taxes that fishermen and hunters pay on ammunition and boat fuel and the tackle that we buy, and those things go directly into fisheries productivity and production and habitat restoration and protection. So hunters and fishermen have always been the ones that step forward to make the investment in making sure that we have healthy habitat and healthy wildlife populations. The idea that needs to be restricted because somehow taking advantage of those opportunities is viewed as cruel or whatever. I mean, that's just an absurd premise to me. Like I am happy to buy a fishing license. I'm happy when they increase the cost of a fishing license, as long as I understand that money is going to go back into making the investments in the things that are important for me to be able to get on the water and take my family. I don't mind buying duck stamps. I don't mind my excise taxes. But I want people to understand that I'm paying those things willingly and willing to pay more so that I can have the opportunity to do things that I like to do.
Yeah. What do you think about gators? Do we need to be hunting more gators? Aren't they overpopulated? What in the world?
We absolutely need to find a way to harvest more alligators. We do. And I think there's a lot of understanding behind that. And I think that the reality of what's driving the alligator population is some good policies that were put in place that required alligator farmers, people who harvested the eggs out of the marsh or out of the wetlands, out of the swamp, to raise those alligators for commercial sale. But, the state required that a percentage of those be put back into the water. So, that was a great policy when alligator populations were low. And I think it continues to be a good policy, but it's market factors that are driving the number of alligators are out there. Like the guys who are harvesting the alligators can't get the amount of money that makes it worth it for them to go out there and do the hunting. And so the wild alligator population has really taken off. Now, one of the benefits is it can limit the nutria population. It can limit, the population of some of these invasive species. But I think there's been an absolute proliferation in alligators. And one of the things that I want to work with our Department of Wildlife and Fisheries on is trying to figure out a way to allow recreational folks to harvest more alligators,
Well, thank you, because it's definitely limiting my ability to kayak in the bayou. I tell you that. I'll have to put a pistol in my fanny pack.
You're not going in there.
There are a lot of alligators.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, there are a lot.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Chris, it's been a pleasure to have you with us today. You're obviously, as I said earlier, just a wealth of knowledge on this and seem to understand the balanced perspective that's necessary to both preserve our environment and animal habitat so that we can continue to enjoy the land, really the way I think our founders intended it and the way I think God intended for us to be able to do. So keep up all of your good work, and we hope to have you back on soon.
Yeah. And Chris, before we let you go, if you were going to give us an action item, what can our listeners do who care about these issues? Where can we either support your work, or who should we be contacting to make sure they're doing the right things?
No, I'm glad you asked that, because there's always opportunities, right? There are always, there's meetings that the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority has. There are meetings that our legislature has to talk about these issues. Right now, there's the Corps of Engineers is looking at, potential of making some changes in the way they manage the lower Mississippi River to hopefully benefit hunting and fishing access and better habitat. So there are just numerous opportunities for the public to weigh in on some of these processes. And what I want to encourage people to understand is that, when let's say the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority goes through a master plan process or an annual plan process, there's so many people who just throw up their hands and say, "Oh, that's all baked in, and we can't make a difference." And the reality is you can. I mean, I have seen, because I've worked on some of these plans and I've worked on them through the processes, I have seen plans change from their draft form into their final form because of input from the public. I have seen people be able to make a difference in public policy when it comes to fisheries production and access to the water. I've seen it happen, so while it's frustrating and slow at times because you're dealing with government bureaucracy, the public engagement is absolutely 100% necessary for us to make sure that these things work out in our favor.
Yeah, yeah. Well, while I was researching the show here, I came across a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. I thought it would be appropriate. It's a very short quote here. But basically, what he said was the man who really counts in the world is the doer, not the mere critic, the man who actually does the work, even if roughly and even if imperfectly, not the man who only talks or writes about how it should be done. Well, I think that you fall into the former category, a doer, a man of action. And again, thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch soon, and keep up all your great work.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure talking to you.
All right, you too.
Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit LACAG.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.